All right, so in this next video, we want to talk about global biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are just the pathways by which chemicals are going to circulate through an ecosystem. Like we mentioned earlier, chemicals cycle energy flows. We've already talked about the flow of energy and how it moves from one level to the next, with a great deal being lost given off to the environment in the form of heat. But now we're going to talk about how chemicals can actually cycle through the environment. So a biogeochemical cycle is going to have both a biotic, that's the living, and an abiotic or a non-living component. Those biogeochemical cycles can also be either gaseous or sedimentary. In a gaseous cycle, the element is going to return to and is withdrawn from the atmosphere in the form of a gas. Things like the carbon and nitrogen cycles. The sedimentary cycle is when the element is absorbed from the soil by plant roots, passed to the heterotrophs, and then returned to the soil by decomposers. So a great example of this would be the phosphorus cycle. A reservoir is going to be a source of chemicals unavailable to the producers. So things like the carbon that's found in calcium carbonate shells in the ocean's bottom. This is a great reservoir for storing carbon, but it's not really readily available to the producers. However, we do have an exchange pool. An exchange pool is a source from which organisms can take those chemicals, so either the atmosphere or the soil. The chemicals are going to move along those chains in a biotic community. Human activities can remove chemicals from those reservoirs and exchange pools and release them to the biotic community. In this way, human activities upset the normal balance of nutrients in the environment, which can result in pollution. So here we have our reservoir, so this would be our fossil fuels, minerals and rocks, sediments in the oceans. The exchange pool would be the atmosphere, soil, or water. And then the community would be our producers, decomposers, consumers. And we're going to kind of go through each one of these for a few different cycles. Starting off with the water cycle. The water cycle, or the hydrologic cycle, is going to consist of a couple of different steps. The first is going to be evaporation. The sun's rays are going to cause fresh water to evaporate from seawater, leaving the salts behind. So in the case of evaporation, we're going to see a lot of evaporation from the ocean. Fresh water is going to be taken up into the atmosphere, leaving salt behind. Transpiration is going to be the evaporation of water from plants. So we will see this occurring over land. We're going to see evaporation from lakes and large sources of water, but also transpiration, the evaporation of water from plants. Condensation is when that gas is changed into a liquid. So for example, water is going to condense as it enters the atmosphere. When it enters the atmosphere, it's going to condense and then it's going to form precipitation. It's going to precipitate over land. Rain, snow, sleet, hail, fog, all of that is precipitation over land. Water that precipitates over the land is going to follow a couple of different routes. Because land lies above sea level, gravity is going to eventually return all fresh water to the ocean. Runoff is precipitation that doesn't really enter the ground, but instead it flows directly into streams, lakes, wetlands, or into the ocean. Some water is going to actually sink, though. It's not going to run off in the form of streams. It's actually going to percolate down into the ground, forming what is known as groundwater. Groundwater, groundwater tables or water tables are going to be found at the top, on top of the saturation zone. Aquifers are rock layers that contain water and they release the water into wells and springs. These are going to be refilled as rainfall and melted snow seep into the soil to replenish those aquifers, to replenish that groundwater. However, humans can interfere with the water cycle in a couple of different ways. One of those would be withdrawing water from aquifers, clearing vegetation from land, and building roads and buildings can prevent that percolation and increase runoff. Interfering with the natural processes that purify water and adding pollutants like sewage and chemicals to the water. Groundwater mining is when we withdraw water from the aquifers that exceeds any possibility of recharge, meaning that we take way more water from those aquifers than can be replenished by the melting snow and rain that percolates down. This is going to be done in some parts of the United States. We're going to see this a lot in the arid West and southern Florida. Unfortunately, in these locations, the groundwater levels are going to be dropping. Residents can actually run out of groundwater in just a few years if it is not replenished by other sources. So that's going to be sort of our water cycle. The carbon cycle is where the atmosphere is going to act as an exchange pool for the carbon cycle. Organisms in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems can exchange carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. On land, plants are going to take up carbon dioxide from the air. Through photosynthesis, they're going to incorporate that carbon into nutrients used by autotrophs and heterotrophs. So they're going to absorb that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to make glucose, which can then be taken up by the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. When organisms conduct cellular respiration, the carbon is then returned to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Living and dead organisms serve as a reservoir for the carbon cycle. Ordinarily, the decomposition of plants and animals returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Plant and animal remains that don't decompose are going to be transformed into coal, oil, and natural gas, or fossil fuels. Another reservoir for carbon is the inorganic carbonate that accumulates in limestone. Many marine organisms have calcium carbonate shells that remain in the ocean sediments long after they die. Geologic forces can then change those sediments into limestone. However, human activities do interfere quite a bit with the carbon cycle. More carbon dioxide is being deposited into the atmosphere due to human activities than can actually be removed through photosynthesis. Some of those human activities that contribute to this would be things like deforestation. When we destroy forests, we actually reduce the reservoir and we lose organisms that absorb our excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So deforestation gets rid of our carbon dioxide scrubbers, or our carbon dioxide sponges that soak that excess CO2 out of the atmosphere. We also have a tendency to burn fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels is taking, once again, that carbon reservoir found deep in the earth and putting it up into the atmosphere. So the burning of fossil fuels and the destroying of those forests can make way for farmland and pastures, is actually going to reduce our reservoir, where it's going to reduce our reservoir and on Earth and increase the amount of carbon dioxide available in the atmosphere. Now, the reason why we care about putting too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that large amounts of CO2, nitrous oxide, methane can be emitted due to those human activities. As they accumulate in the atmosphere, they can they form what are known as a greenhouse effect. They can actually allow solar radiation to penetrate, but they block the escape of heat back into space. So the additive effect is that it overall is going to heat up the Earth's surface. Fertilizers and animal waste are going to be huge sources of nitrous oxide. Bacterial decomposition of food in the digestive tracts of animals is going to produce methane. So large herds of cattle can produce methane. Carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane are all going to be some of those greenhouse gases that can contribute to climate change. If the Earth's temperature continues to rise, more water will evaporate, forming more clouds. This sets up a positive feedback effect that would increase global warming even more, because that additional water in the atmosphere is also going to act as a greenhouse gas, allowing the solar rays to penetrate, but not allowing the heat to escape. Most climate scientists agree that the Earth's temperature may rise between 2 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100 if greenhouse emissions continue at our current rates. As the climate change continues, other effects may occur. As the oceans warm, the temperatures in polar regions are going to rise more than in other regions. Sea levels are going to start to rise significantly because the glaciers at either pole are going to start to melt. Droughts can then reduce crop yields and kill trees. Billions of dollars will have to be spent to keep coastal cities from disappearing into the seas. So you should be able to explain the role of reservoirs and the cycling of chemicals in the biosphere. You should be able to identify whether carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus are going to be examples of gaseous or sedimentary biogeochemical cycles. We did not talk about the role of bacteria in the nitrogen cycle, so you don't need to worry about that, but you should be able to summarize some of the ecological problems associated with the water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles, and discuss some of the potential consequences of climate change. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.